I went to see Alice in Chains for the first time in 2013 during the Devil Put Dinosaurs Here tour. I hadn't bothered checking who the opening act was, so I get to the venue and, to my surprise, Chevelle was the opener, and I was already a little familiar with them, having heard a number of their songs played on the radio. I thought they were a pretty good band live, and a few people have requested a full history on the band, so let's get to it. The story of the band begins in Grayslake, Illinois, with two brothers, Pete and Sam Loeffler, who would start playing music together. They were about a year apart or so, and they came from a staunch conservative Catholic family of 7 children. Pete would play guitar and sing while his brother Sam would play drums, beginning in their parents' garage. The Loeffler family didn't have TVs growing up, but they had record players. And Pete would cite Neil Diamond, Sinead O'Connor, Cat Stevens, and other folk music as being one of the reasons that he wanted to learn guitar. The Loeffler family was very musically adept. The boys' uncles were in bands, and his parents put them in piano lessons. The brothers also had older sisters, and they always heard music coming out of their room, bands like Journey, Huey Lewis and the News. And their sisters would also date these guys who would come over to their house and ask the brothers if they've heard of Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, as well as Jimi Hendrix. Pete would tell MTV that he learned guitar by listening to Van Halen's song Eruption. Pete would eventually get into grunge music, citing Bad Motor Finger by Soundgarden as a huge influence on him, more specifically the song Jesus Christ Pose. Growing up in a religious household, it spoke to him about the hypocrisy of religion. Sam, meanwhile, was really into punk groups and post-punk bands, and two bands that frequently come up in interviews were Firehose and Black Flag. The brothers would have a bass player friend named Matt Scott who played with them until 1996. They'd formed 1 year prior in 1995. Their younger brother Joe, however, would soon pick up a bass guitar, and it was pretty clear that his noodling was better than anything their bass player could do, and so he joined the band. Pete and Scott were about 4 to 5 years older than Joe, and all three musicians were self-taught. They weren't so much into sports as, thanks to their dad, they were around cars a lot growing up, and they went to a lot of car shows and drag races. Their father worked as a carpenter, and he built street rods in his spare time, and his favorite car was the 1970s era Chevrolet Chevelle. That's where the band would get their name from. Sam would tell the Oshkosh Western, "Some kids were into sports, we were into anything with wheels. The Chevelle was the epitome of muscle cars, and we thought it would be a funny name. It just stuck, and we've never been able to get rid of it." When Joe was only 14, the band started playing outdoor shows, including backyard barbecues and at clubs in and around Chicago. Joe was apparently so nervous at Chevelle's first gig that he hid his face under his hat, but he soon became more comfortable with playing live shows. It wasn't too long after the band became regulars at clubs like the Metro and Double Door, and Chevelle would credit their early success to playing every show that was literally offered to them, whether it was a club show or a backyard party. They also credited their friends with pushing them to pursue music, with Sam telling a Nevada paper, "I'd say we were almost pushed into it by our close friends we played with. They all said we have a really different sound and we should do something." The three brothers would record a demo tape, and the head of Squint Entertainment caught the band performing at a live show. Squint Entertainment was owned by a distribution company called Word Entertainment. Word Entertainment is a Christian faith-based entertainment company who's helped bands like Sixpence None the Richer to mainstream success. Word Entertainment would distribute a lot of their acts, including Chevelle, to Christian stores, so people initially thought Chevelle was a Christian band. After Chevelle did some digging, they became aware of the Christian background of the label, and they told the reps there that they didn't want to be labeled or marketed as a Christian band. The head of the label assured them they would not be marketed or labeled in such a way, but then they started to do press that Christian bands would typically do, and it would be something the band later regretted, with Pete telling Revolver that the worst thing a band could do in their early days was not being in charge of their image. He would admit that they were lied to by the label, and they still signed with them just because they were excited to be on a label. But that being said, there is a 2011 interview the band gave to the South Bend Tribune where they stated they're not a Christian band, but rather Christians who play music, and they don't believe in injecting religion and politics in their music. The group would release their debut album, Point Number 1, in 1999, and it would be found under a lot of Christian sections in record stores, an unlikely place for hard rock. It probably also didn't help that the band won several GMA Dove Awards. Fun fact you guys may not know about the group's first record is that SNL alumni Fred Armisen would appear in the electronic press kit for the record. Nirvana, Bush, and Pixies producer Steve Albini would actually produce their first record, and the band sold an impressive, I've seen the estimates vary, but it's anywhere between 60 to 100,000 copies, thanks in large part to college radio. Then Chevelle ran into some business issues. The band's label Squint would soon close its doors, and the label's parent company refused to let the band leave for another label. It would result in a prolonged legal battle that nearly destroyed the band. Sam would tell the Oshkosh Western, Joe decided he didn't want to do it anymore. He left and got a job delivering pizza, but was back about 6 months later. The older brothers, meanwhile, went back to working carpentry jobs, which they'd done before, and the band at one point were told by one record label executive that they would have long gray beards before they would ever make their second album. Thankfully for the band, they prevailed, they got out of their recording contract, and soon signed with Epic Records. It was during this period that while they were in limbo, the members would write and record new music that would form the basis for their second record and commercial breakthrough, 2002's Wonder What's Next. Sam would tell the Ventura County Star what inspired their second record, saying it was bitterness. Largely that's what this record came out of, from people telling us we couldn't do what we wanted to do. The band would remark that every time they felt like they were making progress in leaving their old label, they'd hit a brick wall. Their second album would produce two massive singles in The Red and Send the Pain Below. The Red would deal with anger, which Sam claims he was actually responsible for inspiring. Pete would remark to Revolver that when Sam was younger, he would just destroy things, even stuff that he loved, and he would get so angry all he would see was red. Chevelle's manager, during the making of their second record, told the band not to forget about radio because their manager was a big radio guy. But funny enough, he didn't like the song The Red. The band was up in Vancouver recording with Garth Richardson, who had previously worked with Rage Against the Machine on their first record. Richardson in fact pushed the band to do the track, and it would become one of their best known songs. Send the Pain Below wasn't finished when Pete went into the studio, and Garth would tell Pete that the bridge sucked and needed to be fixed, and they didn't really have much time left in the studio. So Pete would go into a room by himself. He wrote the bridge, which was a little heavier than what he originally came up with. Send the Pain Below also dealt with their scuffles they had with their old record label. Those old sibling rivalries would also crop up on the album, especially with the song Family System. Chevelle would be frequently labeled as hard rock and even metal, but by the band's own admission, they didn't call their style of music metal, with Sam telling the Lincoln Journal-Star that their music wasn't, I quote, melodic hard rock, while Pete would tell Revolver they straddled the fence between hard rock and heavy metal. Chevelle would also see a ton of comparisons to groups like Tool, Helmet, System of a Down, and Taproot. It was by the summer of 2003, Chevelle was one of the hottest bands, thanks to constant play on rock radio and MTV. The Red would peak at number 56, while Send the Pain Below would peak at number 65 on the Hot 100 chart. Their second record would go on to sell over 2 million copies in America. It was in 2002 Chevelle would play the side stage at Ozfest, but a year later, in the summer of 2003, they nabbed a main stage slot. So you're maybe wondering what set Chevelle apart from a lot of other bands around this time. Well, Pete would speak to the Green Bay Press Gazette and revealed, "We've always been conscious about making our own sound. We could have completely taken that jaded approach a lot of big bands do and make it sound like something else. We never really wanted that." Chevelle would also do something that wasn't in line with what a lot of other mainstream acts were doing, like the Nickelback, Saving Abel, you guys remember them, and Buck Cherry. Chevelle didn't really write about chicks or relationships. They chose to write about something different. Pete would tell a Missouri publication, "I think if you go and read those lyrics of those cookie cutter bands, hard rock bands out there, you're going to see that they're pretty bad. They're talking about a girl and there's a lot of I and me. There's nothing really to search for and grab a hold of and dig into." With the band consisting of nothing but brothers, you'd think fights would be a common occurrence given what we'd seen in other groups that featured siblings like Oasis, Space Hog, and the Black Crowes, and those bands just feature two siblings. Chevelle would admit that they did fight quite a bit in their early days, and there was one interview Chevelle gave to the Ventura Star in 2003 where they admitted going to therapy together, and two therapists' advice for the brothers was to never speak to each other again. Sam would remark, "I guess they didn't know how to deal with us. We ended up dealing with each other on our own." Despite their second album's success, Pete would tell the Daily Herald in 2005 that the recording of the album felt rushed, recalling, "It wasn't a great experience. We were in a different country for a couple months. It was around 9/11, and we couldn't be home with the people we cared about." Chevelle would return in 2004 with their third record titled "This Type of Thinking Could Do Us In." The band would remark how recording their third album was also a difficult process. Sam would tell a paper, "It was rough. It was January 2nd, and Pete and I were sitting in the studio staring at each other. We'd done over 400 shows in support of our previous album and were completely burnt. We had nothing written and were under the gun to write the follow-up to an album that had gone platinum." Sam would go on to reveal how they'd agreed to take a day off and come back tomorrow and try writing some new music, and it was the same result, and this would go on for nearly 2 months. Then everything kinda clicked. Within 7 months, Chevelle would release an album, and shortly after that, it would go gold. The members would also reveal to the Chicago Tribune that they wanted to write a head-bopping record, with Sam telling the paper, "We have syncopated double bass drum rhythms on this record where the kick drums follow the guitar." Pete wanted to write less about himself and more about outside situations. Breech Birth is about people wanting fame rather than being good at something. It's about American Idol, actually. We also had the idea of incorporating the feel of the first take with the sound of a well-produced record. As the band would hit the road to support their third album and in possible foreshadowing of their future, they would hit some snags on their first date of the tour. Pete would reveal in an interview how Joe would smash his bass guitar and threw it at Sam. Pete would add in the same interview, "When it works, it's amazing," referring to his relationship with his brothers, "but when it doesn't, it's hell. We're like literally living in hell right now. They're my brothers, but you know what? You shouldn't necessarily work with your family." It was in the same interview he would reveal that he deals with the business aspect of the band, while Pete would claim he deals with all the artwork, writing of music, as well as the videos. The first single from the record, Vitamin R, Leading Us Along, would become their first #1 single of their career. The R in the song's title would stand for Ritalin, a drug that the band members didn't take themselves, but something that was actually inspired by a friend of theirs who was on it. Joe would tell the Asbury Park Press, "He took an excess amount of Ritalin. He would drive for hours around in his car until he ran out of gas. He was a strange character as he was, but he was worse with Ritalin." Their younger brother Joe would admit in the same interview that he didn't drink alcohol and that he was deeply conservative, voting for George W. Bush in the 2004 presidential election. Their third album would also produce another several hit singles, including The Clincher, which was about claustrophobia and featured in Madden 2005. They'd release another single in Panic Prone, which would be inspired by a Feed the Children type of commercial, commenting on the choices that people have to help or basically do nothing. It was by the summer of 2005 the band finally ran into some serious issues. Their youngest brother Joe was unhappy and he would leave the group. The brothers claimed that Joe wanted to spend more time with family, but apparently he was fired. Joe would end up putting out his own statement saying that he was fired from the band and that he would have never quit on his own. Pete and Sam would end up enlisting Filter member Gino Leonardo to fill in during this time. It wasn't too long afterwards they brought in their longtime friend and brother-in-law Dean Bernardini to the group. Sam would tell the Chicago Tribune, "Family was all I knew. When Joe left, it was very weird, but Dean has been our friend for over 16 years, so bringing him in was very natural. It's such a fun, happy band now. Joe was unhappy and didn't like to tour, but now it's a very positive place to be." It would seem like following Joe's dismissal from the group, Chevelle would finally reach a level of peace that it hadn't experienced before. But despite this, Pete would admit to Revolver that had the members not all been brothers, they might not have received as much attention as they did. So in a way, all three members being brothers kind of put them on the map, he'd admit. He would go on to say that Joe would even quit the band 3 times before he was finally fired, and the 4th time they just finally had enough. He would add, his demands were just unbelievable, the things he wanted to do. The 4th time we just said, "We've tried, you're out." Pete would go on to add that Joe really wasn't involved in the songwriting and made no effort to be involved, and he wanted to do less and less in the band and still be credited as 1/3 of the group. Some fans were pretty shocked by the news and felt that Joe would be sorely missed, and some claim that Chevelle has never been the same since Joe left the group. As Chevelle turned their attention to what would be their next record, 2007 Vena, Sera, they would remark to the Charlotte Observer that their last record felt more like a concept album at times with long intros and long bridges. This time around, they said they wanted to focus on what they described as, and I quote, "a radio-esque format of a song." Pete would also tell The Observer that he wanted to also sing in higher registers. Pete would be pretty honest about the band's songwriting process, telling El Paso Paper, "We write 2 or 3 radio songs each record. We know we've had a lot of success on the radio. We understand our place, and that's where we've made our niche." For Vena, Sera, the band would record the record at the Palm Resort in Vegas, where they did the drum and bass tracks, and they would do the vocals in Virginia Beach. Recording in the studio next to them at the time was Elton John, and at one point the 3 members had amassed a debt of about $80,000 at the casinos in Vegas. Pete would also remark how he snuck in a pet puppy past the Palm security. The frontman would also credit the salt-enriched air from the ocean for being good for his voice when they were doing the vocals in Virginia Beach. Vegas would be used as the inspiration for one song on the album, The Fad, poking fun at some of the residents, especially the men, who would wear $10,000 worth of clothing and go clubbing, calling it ridiculous. Safer Waters, meanwhile, would address the struggles that humans have in finding purity and innocence in a very complicated and difficult world. The record would debut at number 12 on the Billboard album chart, selling around 62,000 copies in its first week. Chevelle would return in 2009 with the record Sci-Fi Crimes, whose title would be inspired by a trip that the members took to New Mexico, where they visited the Roswell Museum. They had a friend who Pete described as being off the wall, who would drive them around and believed in UFOs. For Sci-Fi Crimes, the band wanted a more stripped down sound, not wanting to use any samples or auto-tuning, with Sam telling the Daily Oklahoman, "We just went in and played the songs and used the takes. The actual sounds we made, no samples, any of that stuff." Chevelle would also take the time to criticize a lot of the radio-friendly bands who sounded too polished and overproduced, and their records sounded nothing like their live shows. Like the title suggests, there are alien-related songs like the track Roswell Spells, while the acoustic track Highlands Apparition deals with a haunted house that the members lived in for a period of about 4 years in suburban Chicago. They would recall seeing mold in the house that would appear, disappear, and then reappear, and they would also be woken up in the night by what they assumed was paranormal activity. The members would even recall one instance of coming home one day to see a 40-year-old woman on the front lawn who told them she comes back every few years to say hi to her father, who built the house. Apparently her father and his cat were supposedly buried in the backyard. The song Letter from a Thief isn't sci-fi related and would be inspired by the theft of the band's equipment. It was during a tour stop in Dallas in 2007. Chevelle's trailer containing their equipment was stolen outside of their hotel. It was in 2011 they would release their follow-up record Hats Off to the Bull, with the title taking its inspiration from Pete's disgust at bullfighting. The song on the record Clones would be the band's answer to critics who claimed they ripped off Tool. The song Face to the Floor would be inspired by a documentary Pete watched about Bernie Madoff. The record would peak at number 20 on the charts. Throughout the next 10 years or so, the band would put out several more records, with their most recent coming out in 2021. In 2019, Dean would announce he was leaving the band to spend more time with family. In the more recent years, Sam would reveal that despite selling 6 million records, Chevelle has made no money off of their album sales. He would go on to estimate that the band has made their label about $50 million in record sales. Pete will later clarify that while yes, the band has made no money off of record sales, they've done well in other aspects of the music business like publishing, touring, and merch. Chevelle would announce this year that they have recorded 10 songs for a new album, but there's no timeline as to when that album would be coming out. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments section below, or you can use our link to our request form as well. We'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.